Chapter 1: The First Step. The world wasn't broken in the way history books described. There were no great wars raging, no apocalyptic disasters looming overhead. People lived their lives as they always had, going to work, scrolling through their feeds, consuming the endless cycle of news, controversy, and distraction. But something was missing. Elias had felt it for years but never knew how to name it. It wasn't sadness exactly. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet, aching emptiness, like the world had forgotten something important. And no one was looking for it anymore. People were still existing, but were they really living? They moved through their days with hollow eyes, numbed by routine. The news thrived on scandal and outrage, pushing fear into the cracks of everyday life. Social media wasn't about connection anymore, it was a performance. They raced for attention. The system had shaped people into something unrecognizable, and the worst part? No one seemed to care. But Elias did. He wasn't powerful or rich. He had no great influence. He had always assumed that changing the world required some grand movement. Some great leader, someone much bigger than himself. Until the day he made his choice. It started small, so small that no one should have noticed. A conversation with a neighbor. A quiet act of kindness for a stranger. A meal paid for without expectation. But someone did notice. A man who had been hard and by years of struggle smiled for the first time in months. A mother burdened by the weight of her worries felt something lift, if only for a moment. And for the first time, Elias saw it, the truth that had been buried under all the noise. People weren't incapable of kindness. They had just forgotten it. And maybe, just maybe, that meant they could remember. So Elias kept going. And that's when the ripple started. Chapter 2: The Spark. At first, Elias thought his efforts would go unnoticed. A kind word to a neighbor, helping a stranger in need, small, almost forgettable gestures. He didn't expect anything in return. He only knew that the world felt different when he chose kindness. But what he hadn't anticipated was that others were watching. One afternoon, a store owner paid for a struggling mother's groceries and didn't wait for a thank you. A man in a calf, inspired by Elias's quiet generosity, left money for the next customer without seeking recognition. And it kept happening. What started as individual acts of kindness began to take on a life of their own. People weren't talking about protests or movements. They weren't preaching or arguing. They were simply living differently. For some, it felt unnatural at first. After all, they had been conditioned to expect the worst in people. But as kindness spread, the skepticism began to waver. Still, not everyone accepted it so easily. There were whispers. Some believed it was a trick, a social experiment. Others dismissed it as naive. People don't just change, they muttered. But Elias kept going. And then, something shifted. A local news station, desperate for a story that didn't revolve around crisis or scandal, ran a piece about Elias, about the quiet chain reaction happening in the town. They treated it like a novelty, an odd human interest segment wedged between reports of economic downturns and political disputes. But the world noticed. People outside the town began talking about it. Some were curious, some were doubtful. Some were furious at the idea that love, not power, not force, could change anything. Elias wasn't looking for attention. He had never intended to start a movement. But something had already begun. And no one could stop it now. Chapter 3: Breaking the Cycle. At first, the media treated it as an anomaly, quirky, feel-good piece wedged between reports of crime and scandal. No one expected it to matter. But something was different this time. Instead of fading into obscurity, the story kept growing. People latched onto it not as entertainment, but as possibility. Communities beyond Elias's town began mirroring what they saw. Local businesses shifted their priorities. offering services based on need instead of profit. Neighbors started looking out for one another without expectation. Acts of generosity spread faster than any viral trend. And that's when the system started to panic. News outlets, once comfortable in their role of amplifying division, suddenly faced an unexpected dilemma. Fear was losing its grip. The ratings that had relied on controversy began dropping. Scandals no longer held their usual power. For the first time in decades, positive stories were outperforming destruction. The media wasn't the only one noticing. Corporations built on greed and scarcity struggled to keep people consuming out of habit. Advertisers found their usual tactics failing as society began redefining value not in possessions, but in connection. Politicians, long accustomed to controlling narratives, whispered among themselves, "How do you govern a population that no longer relies on control?" They tried to reunite, but fear tried to remind people why the old systems were necessary. But the people weren't listening. They had seen something better, and there was no going back. Chapter for Resistance. Not everyone welcomed the change. Greed was deeply ingrained in the world, woven into governments, corporations, and media giants. The idea that people could turn away from conflict, that they could reject the systems designed to keep them dependent on fear, was dangerous to those who thrived on manipulation. So they fought back. At first, the media launched its assault. News stations labeled the movement a cult, twisting its message into something sinister. Pundits framed the kindness revolution as reckless and illusion built on unrealistic ideals. People need structure, they argued. This movement is chaos disguised as kindness. But the people weren't listening. They had seen the truth firsthand. They had felt the warmth growing in their communities, witnessed the shift in how strangers treated one another. No headline, no smear campaign could undo what was happening on the ground. When media manipulation failed, politicians took their turn. Laws were drafted to restrict unregistered gatherings, to place barriers around charitable efforts that weren't monitored by governing bodies. They tried to regulate kindness, tried to make it something controlled rather than freely given. But this wasn't an organization. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a movement with leaders or agendas. It was simply people choosing to live differently. And no legislation could stop that. Some leaders attempted to reignite division, fueling distrust among their followers, warning that the rise of self-sufficiency would lead to instability. They pointed to history, to failed utopian ideals, but their words held no weight anymore. People had tasted something pure, and once you've known truth, lies can't reclaim you. Despite their efforts, the resistance against kindness only strengthened the movement. Every attack, every attempt to discredit, only made people more aware of what was being fought against: the greed, the control, the manipulation they had lived under for so long. The system was cracking, and those in power knew it. Chapter 5: The Awakening. The world hadn't crumbled. Governments had collapsed, not with war or rebellion, but with silence. The institutions that once dictated life, the corporations, the political machines, the systems built on greed had faded into irrelevance. For the first time, people looked around and realized they were free. But what did freedom truly mean? At first, there was hesitation. People had lived within the framework of control for so long that the absence of it felt surreal. The world, stripped of its rulers and structures, was quiet. Then, something remarkable happened. Communities began rebuilding, but not in the way history had taught them. There were no new governments rising from the ashes, no desperate bids for power. Instead, people did what they had always been capable of: they helped each other. Society didn't collapse, it evolved. The media giants, once the architects of division, had lost their grip. Without an audience feeding on fear, they had nothing left to report. Social media shifted back to its roots: connection without competition. No more viral toxicity, no more manufactured outrage. Science and medicine accelerated at an unprecedented pace, without greed slowing progress. Breakthroughs came swiftly. There were no patents blocking innovation, no corporate monopolies hoarding discoveries for profit. Information was shared freely, used for the betterment of all rather than the wealth of a few. Religion, philosophy, personal beliefs all coexisted in a way humanity had never achieved before. People no longer feared different perspectives. There were no wars fought over faith, no persecution over ideals. Belief became a personal journey, not a weapon. And for the first time in history, people lived not by necessity, but by choice. The movement had never been about destroying the old world. It had been about remembering what had always been possible. Chapter 6: The Fall of Control. Governments had long been built on hierarchy, control, and dependency. They thrived on division, using fear to maintain their grip on the people. For centuries, they dictated the rules: who prospered, who suffered, who held the power, and who remained powerless. But the movement changed everything. At first, politicians ignored it. They assumed it would fade, just another idealistic wave crashing against the immovable rock of reality. But the tide kept rising. People stopped fearing the things they were told to fear. They no longer fed into the endless cycle of outrage and control. They stopped relying on governments to solve problems. They had learned to solve themselves together. Local communities became stronger, self-sufficient. The need for bureaucratic oversight weakened as people simply took care of each other. Without division, politicians had no platforms to stand on. Without fear, corporations lost their grip on consumer dependency. Without greed, the structures that thrived on scarcity crumbled. It wasn't enterprising. There were no riots, no forced revolution. Governments didn't fall because they were overthrown. They fell because they were ignored. At first, lawmakers tried to regain control by issuing mandates designed to restore public reliance. They attempted to reassert power, but fewer people listened. The movement had already shifted priorities. People had learned that governance, as it had once existed, was unnecessary when communities functioned on trust and mutual care. The cracks deepened. Traditional economic systems, once fueled by consumption and excess, began to weaken. Money itself lost meaning when people realized value wasn't tied to wealth, it was tied to connection. Governments scrambled to hold on, offering reforms, concessions, anything to maintain influence. But it was too late. The world had already moved past them. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was quiet, slow, and undeniable. Within a generation, traditional power structures dissolved. Leadership still existed, but it was no longer sought after it was earned. Guidance came from those who served, not from those who sought control. The world had not crumbled, it had evolved. For the first time in history, humanity was free because they had chosen to be.